Welcome, dear viewers, to a story that spans millennia, narrative both tender and profoundly thought-provoking, that has remained largely hidden in the shadows of history. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary journey through time to uncover the long, often overlooked history of people born with Down syndrome. This is not merely a medical tale or a clinical examination. It is fundamentally a human story, one that reveals the depths of both our capacity for compassion and our potential for cruelty, our progress toward understanding and our stubborn resistance to change. From the earliest human civilizations, where their presence was shrouded in mystery and misunderstanding, through centuries of stigma, neglect, and institutionalization, to the more recent decades marked by groundbreaking advocacy, legislative victories, and slowly shifting perceptions, this journey reveals not only how remarkably far we have traveled as a society, but also illuminates the considerable distance we still must traverse to ensure that every life, regardless of cognitive ability, is recognized as inherently valuable and brimming with untapped potential. Before we dim the lights and settle into this deeply moving exploration, I invite you to take a moment. This content resonates with you. If you find value in these often untold stories too, like this video and subscribe to our channel. But please, only do so if you genuinely connect with what we're trying to accomplish here. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important, often forgotten narratives to light. I'm always fascinated to learn about our global community, so please share in the comments below where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you watching this as the sun rises over Tokyo, during a quiet lunch break in London, or perhaps as the stars emerge over São Paulo? These connections across time zones and continents remind us that human stories, like the one we're about to explore, transcend geographical boundaries and speak to universal experiences of love, acceptance, struggle, and hope. Now, I encourage you to create your perfect listening environment. Perhaps dim those lights, turn on a gentle fan for that soft, comforting background hum that helps us focus. Maybe brew a cup of tea or coffee. Let's ease into tonight's journey together, with open hearts and curious minds, ready to discover a history that has been waiting far too long to be told in its full complexity and beauty. Chapter 1. Whispers from the Ancient World. The dawn of human understanding, long before the existence of medical textbooks, hospitals equipped with genetic counselors, or the sophisticated science that would eventually map the human genome. There were only human eyes watching, wondering, interpreting the world around them through the lenses of myth, emotion, spiritual belief, and instinct. In this distant past, stretching back thousands upon thousands of years, the arrival of any child who looked or behaved differently from societal expectations evoked deep, often profoundly spiritual reactions that varied dramatically from culture to culture and family to family. We must acknowledge from the outset that we don't possess written accounts from these ancient times that explicitly describe what we now understand and term Down syndrome. The condition wouldn't receive its clinical name until 1866, when British physician John Langdon Down first documented what he called Mongolian idiocy, a term that, while scientifically inaccurate and deeply problematic by today's standards, represented one of the first attempts to medically categorize this genetic condition. However, archaeology is that remarkable science that allows us to peer through the mists of time, has provided us with rare, deeply moving glimpses into how our ancestors may have treated individuals with developmental differences. These archaeological discoveries serve as windows into ancient hearts and minds, revealing moments of tenderness that challenge our assumptions about historical attitudes toward disability. The French discovery, a 1,500-year-old testament to love. In 2014, a team of dedicated researchers working in France made a discovery that would profoundly impact our understanding of historical attitudes toward developmental differences. Deep within the earth, in a carefully excavated burial site dating back approximately 1,500 years, they uncovered the remains of a young child whose distinct cranial features strongly suggested what we would now recognize as Down syndrome. But here's what makes this discovery so extraordinarily powerful. This child, despite their obvious physical differences, despite living in an era without medical understanding or social services, was not cast out, discarded, or hidden away in shame. Instead, they were buried with evident care, respect, and love, laid gently to rest in the same sacred manner as every other member of their community. Their burial goods, the positioning of their body, The location within the cemetery, every detail suggested that this child was valued, mourned, and remembered. This might seem like a small detail in the grand sweep of history, but it represents something monumentally significant. What it suggests is that long before medical terminology was invented, long before genetic science could explain chromosomal variations, some people, perhaps many people, responded to difference not with fear, rejection, or superstition, but with fundamental human acceptance and love. Imagine, if you will, this ancient community. Picture the parents who cradled this child, who likely noticed from birth that their little one was different, perhaps slower to reach certain milestones, with distinctive facial features, requiring more patient care. Envision the siblings who played with them, the community members who watched them grow, the elders who blessed them. In a world without modern diagnosis, perhaps this child was simply seen as a quieter soul, a gentler spirit. Maybe they were carried more often, spoken to more softly, included in family gatherings and community celebrations. Maybe, and this is perhaps most beautiful of all, they were loved not in spite of their differences, but because their differences brought something unique and precious to their family and community. Spiritual interpretations across ancient cultures. Throughout various ancient cultures spanning the globe, physical and intellectual differences were frequently interpreted through deeply spiritual lenses that reflected each society's unique understanding of the divine, fate, and human purpose. This spiritual interpretation of difference created a complex tapestry of responses that ranged from reverence to fear, from inclusion to exclusion. In some cultures, individuals with developmental differences were revered as possessing special connections to the divine realm. They were seen as bridges between the earthly and spiritual worlds, blessed with insights unavailable to typical individuals. These societies often believed that such individuals were chosen by higher powers to serve as teachers, healers, or conduits for divine wisdom. Their perceived closeness to the sacred often protected them from harm and ensured their place within the community structure. Conversely, other cultures interpreted physical and cognitive differences through the lens of fear and misunderstanding, without scientific frameworks to explain genetic variations. Some societies attributed these differences to curses, divine punishment for ancestral sins, or malevolent supernatural influences. This fear-based interpretation could lead to tragic outcomes: exclusion, abandonment, or worse. The critical factor determining these varied responses was the intersection of cultural worldview, religious beliefs, available resources, and perhaps, most importantly, the individual compassion of family members and community leaders. Without a consistent framework to understand conditions like Down syndrome, reactions largely depended on the specific culture's mythology, the historical periods, prevailing attitudes, and the personal temperament of the surrounding people. Archaeological evidence, a global pattern of inclusion. The significance of the French discovery becomes even more profound when we consider that it's not an isolated case. Archaeological evidence from multiple continents and time periods suggests that individuals with developmental differences have been part of human communities since our earliest recorded history. Similar burial sites have been discovered in ancient Rome, where individuals with apparent developmental differences were interred with dignity alongside their community members. In the Andes Mountains, ancient burial grounds have revealed remains suggesting that people with various disabilities, including what may have been Down syndrome, were cared for throughout their lives and honored in death. Each of these archaeological discoveries tells us something quietly but powerfully profound. People with Down syndrome have always been part of the human family. Always. Their presence is not a modern phenomenon requiring contemporary solutions. It is not a medical flaw to be corrected or a social problem to be solved through policy and intervention alone. Instead, it represents part of the natural, beautiful diversity of human life, a thread that has been woven into the human story since our very beginning. These ancient burials whisper to us across the vast expanse of time, their message clear and unwavering: I was here, I lived, I loved, and was loved. I mattered to my family and my community. I was not forgotten. As we journey deeper into this historical exploration, we'll discover how that whisper was sometimes tragically drowned out by louder voices of fear, ignorance, and institutionalized discrimination, and how it has slowly, persistently, found its voice again through the courage of advocates, families, and individuals with Down syndrome themselves. Chapter 2: The Classical World, Myths. symbols, and humanity entering civilizations of complexity. As we step forward through the corridors of time into the classical world encompassing the great civilizations of ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, India, China, and beyond, we enter societies rich with sophisticated mythology, complex philosophical systems, and elaborate symbolic frameworks for understanding human existence. These were civilizations that built magnificent temples, developed intricate legal systems, created enduring works of art and literature, and pondered deeply the fundamental questions of human nature and purpose. In these advanced societies, difference wasn't always interpreted through medical or scientific lenses. Indeed, such frameworks didn't yet exist. Instead, variations in human appearance, behavior, and ability were often understood through elaborate metaphorical systems, religious interpretations, and mystical significance. People who looked or acted differently from societal norms were frequently cast in symbolic roles that reflected their culture's deepest beliefs about fate, divine intervention, and cosmic order. The symbolism of difference in this classical world. Individuals with cognitive or physical differences were rarely perceived simply as people with medical conditions, requiring care and support. Instead, they became powerful symbols, living embodiments of their society's beliefs about the relationship between the human and divine realms, the nature of fate and destiny, and the meaning of suffering and blessing. Some cultures interpreted the birth of a child with differences as a sign that the gods had chosen that family for special attention. These children were seen as touched by divine forces, vessels of divine will, living omens that could predict future events, or cosmic messengers bringing important spiritual information to their communities. In such societies, families might feel honored to care for these special children, believing their presence brought divine protection and wisdom. However, the symbolic interpretation of difference could also lead to tragic outcomes. Other cultures viewed individuals with developmental differences with deep suspicion and fear, interpreting their presence as signs of cosmic imbalance, spiritual impurity, or evidence that their family had committed serious ancestral sins that required punishment or atonement. This fear-based symbolism could result in exclusion, abandonment, or persecution. The crucial point to understand is that in either case, whether revered or feared, individuals with differences were rarely seen simply as human beings deserving love, care, and inclusion based on their inherent human dignity. They were symbols first, people second. Life in a world without genetics. This was, we must remember, a world long before genetic science could explain chromosomal variations, before medical professionals could provide accurate diagnoses and supportive interventions. If a child was born with Down syndrome displaying the characteristic soft facial features, experiencing slower speech and motor development, exhibiting the gentler demeanor often associated with the condition, their presence in the family and community might spark elaborate stories, religious interpretations, and mythological explanations rather than medical understanding and appropriate support services. Imagine the parents in ancient Athens or Rome, noticing that their newborn looked different from their other children, developed more slowly, required extra patience and care. Without genetic counselors to explain trisomy 21, without early intervention services to provide support, without a community of other families facing similar joys and challenges, these parents would have been left to navigate their journey alone, guided only by their culture's prevailing beliefs about difference and disability. Some cultures might have told these parents that their child was blessed, closer to the spirit world, possessing special insights unavailable to typical individuals, destined for a unique role in the cosmic order. Other societies might have filled them with fear, suggesting their child carried bad luck, represented divine punishment for hidden sins, or posed some threat to community, harmony, and prosperity. Egyptian and Greco-Roman mythological frameworks and the sophisticated mythological traditions of Egypt and the Greco-Roman world, stories abounded of children born under strange astronomical conditions, touched by divine forces during conception or birth, or marked by the gods for special purposes. While these ancient texts don't contain clear, unmistakable references to Down syndrome specifically, they reflect worldviews where human difference was consistently interpreted as manifestation of fate, prophecy, or divine intervention. Egyptian mythology, with its complex pantheon of gods and elaborate beliefs about the afterlife, often portrayed physical and mental differences as reflections of divine will. Some individuals with differences were associated with specific deities, perhaps seen as earthly representatives of gods known for their wisdom, gentleness, or special insights into hidden mysteries. Greek mythology, similarly, contained numerous stories of individuals marked by the gods for unique purposes. The Greeks, with their sophisticated philosophical traditions and deep interest in human nature, might have interpreted the presence of a child with Down syndrome through the lens of their beliefs about fate, character, and the relationship between physical appearance and spiritual essence. Roman society, with its emphasis on civic duty and social order, developed its own complex ways of understanding and responding to human difference. Roman attitudes toward individuals with developmental differences varied considerably depending on social class, family resources, and prevailing cultural attitudes of specific historical periods. The variability of ancient responses. What becomes clear as we examine these ancient civilizations is that there was no single uniform way of responding to individuals with developmental differences. The treatment these individuals received depended on a complex interplay of factors: their culture's dominant worldview, their family's social and economic status, their community's current beliefs about divine will and human purpose, and perhaps most critically the individual compassion and wisdom of their immediate caregivers. In some villages and city-states, a child with visible differences might be raised at the very heart of family life, surrounded by siblings who played with them, parents who cherished them, grandparents who told them stories, and community members who included them in festivals and celebrations. These children might grow up feeling loved, valued, and secure in their place within their social world. In other communities, however, the same child might face very different circumstances. They might be hidden from public view, excluded from community gatherings, denied educational opportunities, or even abandoned if their families felt unable to cope with the challenges and social stigma associated with raising a child with differences. Ancient Hindu perspectives, karma and reincarnation. The ancient Hindu tradition, with its sophisticated concepts of karma, reincarnation, and spiritual evolution, developed particularly complex ways of understanding human difference. Some ancient Hindu texts describe children born with certain characteristics as manifestations of karmic cycle souls returning in new forms to teach important lessons, to heal old spiritual wounds, or to be healed through the love and service of their families and communities. This karmic interpretation could lead to several different responses. Some families might view caring for a child with developmental differences as a sacred honor, an opportunity to serve a special soul, and thereby advance their own spiritual development. They might believe that their child possessed wisdom from previous lives, special insights into spiritual truth, or unique connections to divine consciousness. However, this same karmic framework could also be interpreted more negatively. Some might view developmental differences as evidence of negative karma from past lives, suggesting that the individual or their family needed to work through difficult spiritual lessons. This interpretation might lead to blame, shame, or social ostracism. The key insight from examining these ancient Hindu perspectives is that even within a single religious and philosophical tradition, there existed multiple ways of understanding and responding to human difference. The actual treatment individuals received depended largely on which interpretation their particular family and community chose to embrace. Archaeological evidence of care and inclusion. Despite the variability in cultural interpretations, archaeological evidence consistently suggests that many ancient communities chose care and inclusion over abandonment and exclusion. Skeletal remains from various ancient civilizations show clear evidence of individuals with developmental differences who lived for many years, often into adulthood, suggesting they received ongoing care and support from their families and communities. These archaeological findings are particularly significant because caring for an individual with developmental differences in ancient times would have required substantial resources and commitment. Without modern medical care, educational services, or social support systems, families would have needed to provide all care themselves. The fact that many individuals with differences survive to adulthood suggests that their families and communities were willing to invest the extra time, energy, and resources necessary to ensure their well-being. Some ancient burial sites reveal individuals with apparent developmental differences who were interred with valuable grave goods, suggesting they held respected positions within their communities. Others show evidence of careful medical treatment for injuries or illnesses, indicating that these individuals' lives were considered worth preserving and protecting. The foundation for future understanding as we prepare to move forward into the medieval period and beyond. It's important to recognize how these ancient attitudes and interpretations laid the foundation for future understanding of developmental differences. The symbolic frameworks, religious interpretations, and cultural responses developed in these early civilizations would influence attitudes toward individuals with Down syndrome and other developmental differences for centuries to come. Some positive elements from ancient cultures, such as the recognition that individuals with differences might possess special wisdom or spiritual insights, would persist and eventually contribute to more enlightened approaches to disability rights and inclusion. Unfortunately, negative elements such as the association of difference with divine punishment or family shame would also persist, creating barriers to acceptance and inclusion that advocates would spend centuries working to overcome. The ancient world's approach to human difference reminds us that attitudes toward disability are not fixed or inevitable. They are cultural constructions that reflect broader beliefs about love, value, community, and human purpose. As we'll see in the coming chapters, these attitudes would continue to evolve, sometimes progressing toward greater inclusion and understanding, sometimes regressing toward fear and exclusion, but always remaining fundamentally changeable through education, advocacy, and the persistent voices of those who refuse to let any member of the human family be forgotten or discarded. Chapter 3: Medieval Mysteries and Monastic Care. The medieval landscape of faith and fear. As the classical world gave way to the medieval period, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th centuries, European society underwent dramatic transformations that would profoundly impact how individuals with developmental differences were perceived, treated, and cared for. This was an era dominated by Christian faith, feudal social structures, limited literacy, widespread superstition, and the enormous influence of the Catholic Church on every aspect of daily life. The medieval period presents us with a complex and often contradictory picture regarding the treatment of individuals with what we now know as Down syndrome. On one hand, Christian teachings emphasized charity, compassion for the vulnerable, and the inherent value of every human soul created in God's image. On the other hand, medieval society was also characterized by deep suspicion of anything perceived as different or abnormal, often attributing such differences to supernatural causes, demonic influence, or divine punishment for sin. Christian doctrine and the sanctity of life. The rise of Christianity brought with it revolutionary concepts that had the potential to dramatically improve the lives of individuals with developmental differences. Christian doctrine proclaimed that every human being was created in the image of God, Imago Dei, possessed an immortal soul, and deserved love and care regardless of their physical or mental abilities. The teachings of Jesus Christ, with their emphasis on caring for the least of these, serving the vulnerable, and recognizing the divine presence in the marginalized, provided a theological foundation for treating individuals with disabilities with dignity and compassion. Many Christian leaders and theologians of the medieval period wrote eloquently about the spiritual significance of caring for those who were different or disadvantaged. They taught that individuals with developmental differences might be closer to God in their innocence and simplicity, that caring for them was a pathway to salvation, and that their presence in families and communities provided opportunities for others to practice Christian virtues of patience, love, and service. This theological framework led to the establishment of some of the world's first organized care systems for individuals with disabilities. Christian monasteries often served as sanctuaries where people with developmental differences could find safety, care, and acceptance when their families were unable or unwilling to provide support. Monastic communities as centers of care. Medieval monasteries played a crucial role in caring for individuals with developmental differences during a time when few other support systems existed. These religious communities, with their emphasis on service, charity, and care for the vulnerable, often became refuges for people whom society had rejected or abandoned. Monks and nuns, bound by vows of service and compassion, frequently took in individuals with Down syndrome and other developmental differences, providing them with food, shelter, basic medical care, and most importantly, acceptance within a community structure. Some monastic communities developed sophisticated systems of care, assigning specific responsibilities to different members of the religious community and creating structured daily routines that provided security and purpose for individuals with special needs. The monastery of Cluny in France, for example, kept detailed records showing that they regularly cared for individuals with various disabilities, including some who displayed characteristics consistent with what we now understand as Down syndrome. These records describe individuals who were given meaningful roles within the monastic community, helping with simple tasks, participating in religious services, and being valued as full members of the community. Similarly, English monasteries, such as those at Canterbury and Winchester, maintained infirmaries and care facilities that served not only sick and elderly monks, but also individuals from the broader community who had developmental differences. These religious communities understood care for the vulnerable as central to their spiritual mission, not as a burden or charity case. The persistence of superstition and fear despite the positive influence of Christian charity. Medieval society remained deeply influenced by superstitious beliefs about the causes of developmental differences. Many people still attributed the birth of a child with Down syndrome to supernatural forces, demonic influence, parental sin, or divine punishment. These beliefs could lead to tragic outcomes for affected individuals and their families. Some medieval communities believed that children born with distinctive facial features and developmental delays were changelings, fairy children substituted for normal human babies by malevolent supernatural beings. This belief sometimes led to abuse, abandonment, or even infanticide, as families desperately tried to force the changeling to reveal the location of their real child. Other medieval interpretations suggested that individuals with developmental differences were possessed by demons or evil spirits, leading to attempts at exorcism. Religious rituals designed to cast out perceived evil influences, or exclusion from Christian communities and religious services. These negative interpretations created enormous suffering for individuals with Down syndrome and their families, forcing them to hide their loved ones or seek help from the limited number of more enlightened religious communities. Medieval medical understanding. Medieval medicine, such as it was, provided little accurate understanding of developmental differences. Medical knowledge was largely based on ancient Greek and Roman texts, supplemented by religious interpretations and folk remedies. Physicians of the time had no concept of genetics, chromosomal abnormalities, or the true causes of developmental differences. Some medieval medical texts describe individuals with characteristics consistent with Down syndrome, often attributing their condition to imbalanced humors, astrological influences at the time of birth, or the effects of parental behavior during pregnancy. While these explanations were scientifically inaccurate, they sometimes led to more compassionate treatment than supernatural interpretations, as they suggested medical rather than spiritual causes for developmental differences. A few progressive medieval physicians, influenced by Islamic medical scholarship, began to recognize that some individuals with developmental differences could learn skills, participate in community life, and contribute to their families and societies in meaningful ways. However, these enlightened views remained rare and were often overshadowed by prevailing superstitions and fears. Feudal society and social position. The feudal social structure of medieval Europe created particular challenges for individuals with developmental differences and their families. In a society organized around land ownership, military service, and rigid social hierarchies, individuals who couldn't fulfill traditional roles faced uncertain futures. However, some aspects of feudal society could work in favor of individuals with Down syndrome. The feudal emphasis on family loyalty and obligation meant that most families felt strong responsibilities to care for all family members, regardless of their abilities. Extended family networks, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, often shared caregiving responsibilities, ensuring that individuals with special needs weren't abandoned even if their immediate parents died or became unable to provide care. Additionally, the feudal economy's reliance on agriculture and craft production offered opportunities for individuals with Down syndrome to contribute meaningfully to their family's economic survival. Many could help with farming tasks appropriate to their abilities, assist with domestic duties, or learn simple crafts that provided value to their households and communities. The emergence of early hospitals and care institutions during the later Medieval period, particularly in the 12th and 13th centuries, European communities began establishing the first hospitals and charitable institutions, specifically designed to care for individuals with various disabilities and medical conditions. These early institutions, often founded and operated by religious orders, represented significant advances in organized care for vulnerable populations. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, established in the 7th century but significantly expanded during the medieval period, provided care for sick, disabled, and impoverished individuals from throughout the region. Records from this institution describe patients with developmental differences who received long-term care, suggesting that medieval society was beginning to recognize the need for specialized support services. Similar institutions arose in major cities throughout Europe. The Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, founded in 1247, initially served as a general hospital, but gradually began specializing in care for individuals with mental and developmental differences. While treatment methods were often crude by modern standards, these early institutions represented important recognition that individuals with disabilities deserved care and support rather than abandonment or persecution. Women's roles in medieval care. Medieval women, particularly those in religious orders, played crucial roles in caring for individuals with developmental differences. Convents often served as alternatives to monasteries, providing care and sanctuary for women and girls with Down syndrome and other disabilities when their families couldn't provide adequate support. Some medieval saints and religious figures became particularly associated with care for individuals with disabilities. Saint Dymphna, for example, became known as the patron saint of those with mental and developmental differences, and shrines dedicated to her became pilgrimage destinations for families seeking help and healing for their loved ones with special needs. Lay women, too often took leadership roles in caring for community members with developmental differences. Medieval records describe women who served as informal caregivers, advocates, and protectors for vulnerable individuals, often organizing community support networks and ensuring that those who couldn't care for themselves received necessary assistance. The impact of plague and social upheaval. The medieval period was marked by numerous crises that tested society's commitment to caring for its most vulnerable members. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, killed an estimated one-third of the population and created massive social upheaval that affected everyone, but particularly those who depended on others for care and support. During plague years, many institutions that had provided care for individuals with developmental differences were forced to close or drastically reduce services as their caregivers died or fled. Families struggling to survive often found it impossible to provide adequate care for members with special needs. Some individuals with Down syndrome and other disabilities were abandoned during these crisis periods, while others received heroic care from dedicated family members and religious communities who refused to abandon their responsibilities even in the face of personal danger. However, these crisis periods also sometimes revealed the strength of human compassion and community bonds. Records describe instances where surviving community members took in and cared for individuals with disabilities whose families had died from plague, demonstrating that medieval society's commitment to care for the vulnerable could transcend biological family ties. Regional variations in treatment. It's important to recognize that medieval Europe was not monolithic in its treatment of individuals with developmental differences. Different regions, influenced by varying cultural traditions, economic conditions, and religious interpretations, developed distinct approaches to disability and care. In some areas of medieval Europe, particularly regions with strong monastic traditions and established charitable institutions, individuals with Down syndrome and other developmental differences might find relatively good care and acceptance. In other regions, particularly those affected by warfare, economic hardship, or strong superstitious beliefs, treatment could be much harsher. The emergence of medieval universities and centers of learning in cities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford began to create small communities of scholars who approached questions of human difference with greater intellectual rigor and less reliance on pure superstition, while their understanding remained limited by the scientific knowledge of their time. These early scholars sometimes developed more nuanced and compassionate approaches to understanding developmental differences. Legal and prosocial status. legal systems generally provided little protection for individuals with developmental differences, often classifying them as legal dependents without rights to property ownership, marriage, or independent decision. However, these same legal systems usually recognized family obligations to provide care and support, creating some protection against complete abandonment. Some medieval legal documents describe arrangements for the long-term care of individuals with developmental differences, including provisions in wills and inheritance documents that ensured ongoing support. These legal protections, while limited, represented important recognition that individuals with disabilities deserved consideration and planning for their future needs. Setting the stage for Renaissance changes as the medieval period drew to a close, several developments were setting the stage for significant changes in how society would understand and treat individuals with developmental differences. The gradual revival of classical learning, the emergence of Renaissance humanism, and the beginning of more systematic approaches to medical and scientific inquiry would all contribute to evolving attitudes toward disability. The medieval period's legacy regarding Down syndrome and developmental differences was deeply mixed. While Christian charity and monastic care provided some individuals with sanctuary and support, widespread superstition and fear created enormous challenges for many others. The institutional innovations of the medieval period, hospitals, charitable foundations, and organized care systems would provide foundations for future developments, even as their methods and understanding remained primitive by modern standards. As we move forward into the Renaissance and early modern periods, we'll see how new ideas about human nature, scientific inquiry, and social organization would both build upon and challenge the medieval legacy of caring for individuals with developmental differences. Chapter 4: Renaissance Revelations and Early Medical Awakening. The dawn of a new understanding. The Renaissance period, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th centuries, marked a profound transformation in European thought, art, science, and society. This era of rebirth brought renewed interest in classical learning, revolutionary developments in art and literature, the beginnings of modern scientific inquiry, and most importantly for our story, the first stirrings of systematic medical observation and documentation that would eventually lead to better understanding of developmental differences, including Down syndrome. During this remarkable period of human history, we begin to see the first tentative steps away from purely supernatural explanations for human difference and toward more observational, systematic approaches to understanding physical and mental variations. While the Renaissance didn't yet produce accurate medical understanding of genetic conditions, it established intellectual foundations and methodological approaches that would eventually make such understanding possible. Humanism and the dignity of the individual. One of the most significant intellectual developments of the Renaissance was the emergence of humanism, a philosophical movement that emphasized human dignity, individual worth, and the potential for human achievement and growth. This humanistic worldview had profound implications for how society viewed and treated individuals with developmental differences. Renaissance humanists, influenced by rediscovered classical texts and new ideas about human nature, began to argue that all human beings possessed inherent dignity and worth that didn't depend on their intellectual abilities, social status, or physical perfection. This represented a significant departure from medieval thinking that often viewed individuals with disabilities primarily through the lens of divine punishment, supernatural intervention, or charitable obligation. Prominent humanist thinkers like Pico della Mirandola wrote eloquently about the dignity of man and the unique value of every human soul. While these philosophers didn't specifically address developmental disabilities, their emphasis on inherent human worth provided intellectual foundations for more compassionate and inclusive approaches to disability. The Renaissance focus on individual potential and human development also led to new interest in education and learning that would eventually benefit individuals with developmental differences. Although formal educational opportunities for people with disabilities remained extremely limited during this period, the Renaissance emphasis on human educability planted seeds that would eventually grow into more inclusive educational approaches. Artistic representations and social awareness. Renaissance art, with its unprecedented attention to realistic human representation and psychological insight, occasionally depicted individuals who appear to have had developmental differences. While we must be cautious about diagnosing historical figures from artistic representations, Some Renaissance paintings and sculptures seem to show individuals with characteristics consistent with Down syndrome and other developmental conditions. These artistic depictions are significant not because they provide definitive historical evidence, but because they suggest that individuals with developmental differences were present and visible in Renaissance society. Rather than being completely hidden or institutionalized, some individuals with disabilities were apparently integrated enough into community life to appear in artistic works. Some Renaissance artists, particularly those interested in depicting the full range of human experience, created works that showed individuals with various physical and mental differences as part of larger community scenes. These artistic representations often portrayed people with disabilities as dignified participants in social and religious life, rather than as objects of pity or fear. The famous Renaissance artist, Giuseppe Arciboldo, known for his composite portraits, made from fruits, vegetables, and other objects, created some works that may have been inspired by his observations of individuals with unusual physical characteristics, including some who might have had developmental differences. While these artistic experiments were primarily aesthetic rather than documentary, they suggest an artistic culture that was interested in exploring and representing human variation. Early medical documentation and systematic observation. The Renaissance period saw the beginning of more systematic medical observation and documentation that would eventually lead to better understanding of developmental conditions. While physicians of this era still lacked accurate knowledge about genetics and the true causes of developmental differences, they began keeping more detailed records of unusual cases and attempting to categorize different types of medical conditions. Italian physician Girolamo Cardano, 1501 to 1576, wrote some of the earliest detailed medical descriptions of individuals who appear to have had developmental differences. While his explanations for their conditions were still largely based on humoral theory and astrological influences, his careful observations and systematic documentation represented important steps toward more scientific approaches to understanding disability. Similarly, the famous Swiss physician, Paracelsus 1493 to 1541, made detailed observations of individuals with various developmental conditions, attempting to understand their physical characteristics and behavioral patterns. Although his theoretical explanations remained largely speculative, his emphasis on careful observation and detailed documentation laid important groundwork for future medical advances. The Renaissance period also saw the publication of some of the first medical texts that included systematic discussions of developmental differences. These early medical works often contained inaccurate theories about causation, but they represented important attempts to move beyond purely supernatural explanations toward more naturalistic understanding of human variation. The printing revolution and knowledge dissemination. The invention of movable type printing in the mid-15th century had enormous implications for the advancement of medical knowledge and the dissemination of information about developmental differences. For the first time in human history, medical texts, observational studies, and case reports could be widely distributed, allowing physicians and scholars from different regions to share their observations and build upon each other's work. This printing revolution meant that isolated observations of individuals with Down syndrome and other developmental conditions could be collected, compared, and analyzed in ways that had never before been possible. While accurate understanding would still be centuries away, the ability to share and compare cases represented a crucial step toward eventual scientific understanding. Some of the earliest printed medical texts included descriptions of individuals with developmental differences, often accompanied by woodcut illustrations that attempted to depict their physical characteristics. These early medical illustrations, while often crude and sometimes inaccurate, represented important attempts to create visual documentation of human variation that could be shared among medical practitioners. Educational innovations and early intervention concepts. The Renaissance period's emphasis on education and human development led to some of the first systematic thinking about educational approaches for individuals with disabilities. While formal, special education remained centuries in the future, Renaissance educators began to develop more sophisticated understanding of different learning styles and the potential for individuals with various abilities to acquire knowledge and skills. Some Renaissance scholars, influenced by classical texts about education and human development, began to argue that individuals with developmental differences could benefit from appropriate instruction and training. These early educational theorists emphasized the importance of patience, individualized instruction, and recognition that different students might require different approaches to learning. The Italian educator Vittorino da Feltre, 1378 to 1446, established schools that welcomed students with various abilities and learning differences, emphasizing individualized instruction and the belief that all children possessed educable potential. While his schools primarily served wealthy families and didn't specifically focus on developmental disabilities, his educational philosophy represented important recognition that human learning takes many different forms. The scientific revolution's early impact. The later Renaissance period witnessed the beginning of what would become known as the scientific revolution, with its emphasis on systematic observation, experimentation, and evidence-based reasoning. While this scientific approach wouldn't immediately transform understanding of developmental differences, it established methodological foundations that would eventually make accurate genetic and medical knowledge possible. Renaissance scientists, like Leonardo da Vinci (1452–1519), conducted detailed anatomical studies that advanced understanding of human development and variation. Although da Vinci's anatomical work focused primarily on typical human development, his systematic approach to studying human variation and his detailed documentation methods provided models for future researchers who would study developmental differences. The Renaissance physician Andreas Vesalius, 1514–1564, revolutionized anatomical study through his careful dissections and detailed illustrations of human anatomy. While Vesalius didn't specifically study developmental differences, his emphasis on direct observation rather than reliance on ancient texts established scientific methods that would eventually be applied to understanding conditions like Down syndrome. Religious and philosophical developments. The Renaissance period saw significant developments in religious thought that affected attitudes toward individuals with developmental differences. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in the early 6th century, brought new emphasis on individual relationships with God and personal spiritual responsibility that had complex implications for disability. Some Protestant reformers emphasized that God's love and salvation were available to all people, regardless of their intellectual abilities, potentially creating more inclusive attitudes toward individuals with developmental differences. However, Protestant emphasis on individual Bible reading and personal spiritual understanding could also create challenges for those with cognitive limitations. The Catholic Counter-Reformation responded to Protestant challenges by emphasizing traditional Catholic teachings about charity, care for the vulnerable, and the spiritual value of serving those in need. This reaffirmation of charitable obligations helped maintain and strengthen institutional support for individuals with disabilities in Catholic regions. Renaissance philosophers like Michel de Montaigne, 1533–1592, wrote thoughtfully about human variation and the dignity of different types of human experience. Montaigne's essays explored themes of human diversity, the relativity of normalcy, and the importance of accepting and valuing different forms of human existence, ideas that would eventually contribute to more inclusive approaches to disability. Economic and social changes. The Renaissance period's economic transformations had significant implications for individuals with developmental differences and their families. The growth of trade, the emergence of banking systems, and the development of more complex urban economies created new opportunities for some individuals with disabilities, while also creating new challenges. Urban growth meant that some families had access to more specialized care and support services, including physicians, charitable institutions, and religious communities dedicated to caring for vulnerable populations. However, urban life also meant less reliance on extended family networks and agricultural communities that had traditionally provided support for individuals with special needs. The Renaissance period saw the emergence of merchant families with sufficient wealth to provide specialized care for family members with developmental differences. Some wealthy Renaissance families employed private tutors, caregivers, and medical practitioners specifically to support family members with disabilities, representing early examples of individualized support services. Legal and social status evolution. Renaissance legal systems began developing more sophisticated approaches to questions of guardianship, inheritance, and the rights of individuals with developmental differences. While these legal developments remained limited and often paternalistic, they represented important recognition that individuals with disabilities required legal protections and systematic consideration of their needs. Some Renaissance legal documents describe detailed arrangements for the care of individuals with developmental differences, including trust funds, guardianship appointments, and specific instructions for ongoing support. These legal innovations demonstrated growing recognition that planning for the needs of individuals with disabilities required systematic attention and resources. The emergence of Renaissance concepts of citizenship and civic participation raised new questions about the social roles and responsibilities of individuals with developmental differences. While full inclusion remained centuries away, Renaissance political theorists began to grapple with questions about who belonged in the political community and what obligations communities had toward their most vulnerable members. Regional variations in cultural exchange. The Renaissance period's increased trade, travel, and cultural exchange meant that different regional approaches to disability could be compared and evaluated in ways that hadn't previously been possible. Italian city-states, German principalities, French kingdoms, and English communities developed different approaches to caring for individuals with developmental differences, and Renaissance travelers and scholars began documenting and comparing these different systems. Some Renaissance regions became known for their particularly advanced or compassionate approaches to disability care. The Italian city-states, with their wealth from trade and their Renaissance emphasis on humanism and individual dignity, often developed more sophisticated support systems than other regions. The Renaissance period's cultural exchange also meant that medical knowledge and treatment approaches could spread more rapidly than in previous eras. Physicians and scholars traveling between different regions could observe different approaches to caring for individuals with developmental differences and share effective methods with colleagues in other areas. The persistence of superstition and fear. Despite Renaissance advances in scientific thinking and humanistic philosophy, many traditional superstitions and fears about developmental differences persisted throughout this period. Many people continued to attribute conditions like Down syndrome to supernatural causes, divine punishment, or malevolent influences. The Renaissance period's fascination with magic, astrology, and occult explanations for natural phenomena sometimes reinforced, rather than challenged, supernatural interpretations of developmental differences. Some Renaissance texts described individuals with unusual physical or mental characteristics as products of astrological influences, magical interventions, or supernatural breeding. However, the Renaissance period also saw the beginning of systematic challenges to superstitious explanations. Renaissance scholars increasingly emphasized the importance of natural rather than supernatural causation, laying groundwork for eventually more accurate understanding of genetic conditions. Setting the stage for Enlightenment progresses. The Renaissance period drew to a close in the 17th century. Several important developments were setting the stage for more dramatic advances during the coming age of Enlightenment. The scientific revolution had established methodological foundations for systematic inquiry into natural phenomena, including human development and variation. Renaissance humanism had created philosophical frameworks emphasizing human dignity and individual worth that would eventually support more inclusive approaches to disability. The printing revolution had made possible the widespread dissemination of medical knowledge and observational studies that would accelerate future scientific progress. Most importantly, the Renaissance period had begun the long process of moving away from purely supernatural explanations toward more naturalistic understanding of human difference. While accurate knowledge of genetic conditions remained centuries in the future, the Renaissance established intellectual and methodological foundations that would eventually make such knowledge possible. The Renaissance legacy regarding developmental differences was largely positive, despite its limitations. This period saw the beginning of systematic medical documentation, the development of more sophisticated educational approaches, the emergence of humanistic philosophy that emphasized individual dignity, and the establishment of scientific methodologies that would eventually lead to accurate understanding. As we move forward into the Age of Enlightenment and the modern era, we'll see how Renaissance foundations supported increasingly sophisticated and compassionate approaches to understanding and supporting individuals with Down syndrome and other developmental differences. Chapter 5: The Age of Enlightenment: Reason, Compassion, and early reformed the Enlightenment revolution in human understanding. The 18th century, Age of Enlightenment, marked one of the most significant transformations in human thought since the Renaissance, with profound implications for how society understood and treated individuals with developmental differences. This remarkable period, characterized by emphasis on reason, empirical observation, natural rights, and human progress, laid crucial intellectual foundations for modern approaches to disability rights and inclusion. Enlightenment thinkers challenged traditional authorities, questioned long-held assumptions about human nature and society, and developed new frameworks for understanding human dignity and potential. While the Enlightenment didn't immediately transform the lives of individuals with Down syndrome, it established philosophical and scientific foundations that would eventually support revolutionary changes in attitudes toward disability. The period's emphasis on reason over superstition meant that supernatural explanations for developmental differences began giving way to more naturalistic inquiry. Enlightenment scholars increasingly sought to understand human variation through systematic observation and rational analysis rather than religious or mystical interpretation. John Locke and the blank slate theory. English philosopher John Locke, 1632 to 1704, made contributions to Enlightenment thinking that had enormous implications for understanding developmental differences. Locke's famous theory that the human mind begins as a blank slate, tabula rasa, shaped by experience and education, suggested that human potential wasn't fixed at birth, but could be developed through appropriate environmental influences. This philosophical framework had revolutionary implications for individuals with developmental differences. If human capabilities were primarily shaped by experience and education rather than predetermined by birth, then individuals with conditions like Down syndrome might have far greater potential for learning and development than previously assumed. Locke's emphasis on the educability of all human beings provided intellectual foundations for what would eventually become special education and individualized support services. His writings suggested that, with appropriate instruction and environmental support, individuals with various abilities could develop their capabilities and contribute meaningfully to society. While Locke himself didn't specifically address developmental disabilities, his philosophical framework supported more optimistic and inclusive approaches to human difference. Enlightenment educators influenced by Locke's ideas began developing more systematic approaches to instruction that recognized different learning styles and capabilities. Voltaire and religious tolerance. French philosopher Voltaire, 1694 to 1778, championed religious tolerance, intellectual freedom, and opposition to persecution of individuals deemed different or abnormal by prevailing authorities. While Voltaire didn't specifically focus on disability issues, his passionate advocacy for tolerance and acceptance of human diversity created intellectual climates more supportive of individuals with developmental differences. Voltaire's criticism of religious superstition and his emphasis on rational inquiry helped undermine supernatural explanations for developmental differences that had often led to persecution or abandonment. His advocacy for civil rights and protection of vulnerable populations provided philosophical frameworks that would eventually support disability rights movements. The Enlightenment emphasis on tolerance and acceptance of diversity meant that communities influenced by these ideas were often more welcoming to individuals with developmental differences, while full inclusion remained distant. Enlightenment principles supported more compassionate and accepting attitudes toward human variation. David Hume, an empirical observation. Scottish philosopher David Hume, 1711 to 1776, emphasized the importance of empirical observation and systematic inquiry in understanding human nature and behavior. Hume's philosophical methods encouraged more careful and systematic study of human development and variation, laying groundwork for eventually more accurate scientific understanding of conditions like Down syndrome. Hume's emphasis on experience-based knowledge rather than abstract theorizing supported more observational approaches to understanding developmental differences. Instead of relying on ancient texts or religious explanations, scholars influenced by Hume's methods began conducting more systematic studies of individuals with various conditions. This empirical approach represented crucial progress toward eventual scientific understanding of genetic conditions, while accurate knowledge remained over a century away. Enlightenment emphasis on systematic observation established. Methodological foundations for future medical advances. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a natural human goodness. French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778, developed theories about human nature and education that had significant implications for understanding developmental differences. Rousseau's belief in the natural goodness of human beings and his emphasis on individualized education based on each person's unique characteristics provided frameworks supportive of individuals with special needs. Rousseau's educational philosophy emphasized following the natural development of each child rather than forcing all children into identical educational molds. This individualized approach recognized that different children had different capabilities, learning styles, and developmental timelines. Insights that would eventually benefit individuals with developmental differences. While Rousseau's own writings about individuals with disabilities were sometimes problematic by modern standards, his overall educational philosophy supported more inclusive and individualized approaches to human development. Enlightenment educators influenced by Rousseau began developing more flexible and responsive educational methods. The rise of systematic medicine and early psychiatry. The Enlightenment period witnessed significant advances in medical knowledge and the emergence of more systematic approaches to studying mental and developmental conditions. While physicians still lacked accurate understanding of genetic causes, they began developing more sophisticated methods for observing, documenting, and categorizing human variation. French physician Philippe Pinel, 1745 to 1826, revolutionized approaches to mental health treatment through his emphasis on humane care, systematic observation, and belief in the potential for improvement in individuals with various conditions. While Pinel primarily focused on mental illness rather than developmental differences, his methods and philosophy influenced approaches to all forms of cognitive variation. Pinel's emphasis on treating individuals with mental and cognitive differences as human beings deserving dignity and appropriate care represented dramatic departure from previous approaches that often viewed such individuals as dangerous, possessed, or beyond help. His work at hospitals in Paris demonstrated that humane treatment could lead to significant improvements in behavior and functioning. The Enlightenment period also saw the emergence of more systematic medical documentation of developmental differences. Physicians began keeping detailed case records, attempting to identify patterns in development and behavior, and sharing their observations with colleagues across Europe and America. Educational innovations and early special education emphasis on education and human development led to some of the first systematic efforts to provide appropriate instruction for individuals with developmental differences. While these early educational approaches remained limited and often paternalistic, they represented important recognition that individuals with disabilities could benefit from appropriate instruction. French educator Abbé de l'Épée, 1712 to 1789, developed revolutionary methods for educating deaf students, demonstrating that individuals with sensory disabilities could acquire sophisticated knowledge and skills when provided with appropriate instructional methods. While de l'Épée focused on deafness rather than developmental differences, his work established principles of individualized instruction that would eventually benefit individuals with various disabilities. Similarly, Valentin Hors, 1745 to 1822, developed innovative approaches to educating blind students, creating tactile methods for reading and writing that demonstrated the educability of individuals with visual impairments. These educational pioneers established crucial precedents for believing in the learning potential of individuals with various disabilities. While systematic education for individuals with developmental differences like Down syndrome remained largely undeveloped during the Enlightenment, the period's educational innovations and philosophical emphasis on human educability laid important groundwork for future advances. Economic and social reform movements. The Enlightenment period saw the emergence of systematic social reform movements that sought to improve conditions for vulnerable populations, including individuals with disabilities. Enlightenment thinkers increasingly recognized that social problems required systematic solutions rather than relying solely on private charity or religious institutions. Some Enlightenment reformers began advocating for government responsibility to provide care and support for individuals with disabilities. While these early reform efforts remained limited, They represented important recognition that society had collective obligations toward its most vulnerable members. The period's emphasis on natural rights and human dignity provided philosophical foundations for arguments that individuals with disabilities deserved social support and protection, while full disability rights remained centuries away. Enlightenment political philosophy contained seeds of ideas that would eventually support more inclusive approaches. The American and French Revolutions impact. The American Revolution 1776 and French Revolution 1789 embodied Enlightenment principles of natural rights, human equality, and democratic governance that had complex implications for individuals with developmental differences. While neither revolution immediately transformed the lives of people with disabilities, both established political frameworks that would eventually support more inclusive approaches. The American Declaration of Independence's assertion that all men are created equal with unalienable rights provided philosophical foundations that would eventually be extended to include individuals with disabilities. While this inclusion took nearly 2 centuries to achieve, the revolutionary period's emphasis on universal human rights established crucial precedents. Similarly, the French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed universal human rights and dignity that could theoretically be extended to include individuals with developmental differences. The revolutionary period's emphasis on equality and social reform created political climates more supportive of systematic efforts to improve conditions for vulnerable populations. Religious and moral philosophy, developments. Enlightenment period. Developments in religious and moral philosophy had significant implications for attitudes toward individuals with developmental differences. The period saw movement away from punitive religious interpretations that viewed disability as divine punishment toward more compassionate approaches that emphasized human dignity and moral obligation to care for the vulnerable. Some Enlightenment religious thinkers developed more sophisticated theologies that recognized individuals with developmental differences as full members of human and religious communities deserving love, care, and spiritual consideration. These theological developments helped undermine supernatural explanations for disability, while maintaining religious foundations for compassionate care. The period's emphasis on rational moral philosophy led to more systematic thinking about social obligations toward individuals with special needs. Enlightenment moral philosophers increasingly argued that societies had duties to provide care and support for vulnerable members, based on principles of justice and human dignity rather than mere charity. Scientific and medical advances. While the Enlightenment period predated accurate genetic understanding, it saw significant advances in medical knowledge and scientific methodology that laid foundations for eventual understanding of conditions like Down syndrome. The period's emphasis on systematic observation, experimentation, and rational inquiry established crucial scientific methods. Enlightenment physicians began conducting more careful studies of human development and variation, attempting to identify patterns and causes of different conditions. While their explanations remained largely speculative, their systematic approaches represented important progress toward eventual scientific understanding. The period also saw advances in understanding of anatomy, physiology, and human development that provided building blocks for future genetic discoveries. Enlightenment scientists' emphasis on natural rather than supernatural causation helped establish intellectual frameworks supportive of eventually accurate scientific explanations. International exchange and comparison. The Enlightenment period's increased international communication and exchange meant that different national approaches to disability could be compared and evaluated systematically. Enlightenment scholars traveling between different countries began documenting and comparing various methods of caring for individuals with developmental differences. This international exchange accelerated the spread of more effective and humane approaches to disability care. Regions that developed particularly successful methods could share their innovations with others, leading to gradual improvements in treatment approaches across Europe and America. The period's emphasis on rational comparison and evaluation meant that traditional approaches to disability could be systematically examined and reformed. Enlightenment reformers increasingly challenged practices that seemed cruel, ineffective, or based on superstition rather than rational consideration. women's contributions and changing gender roles. The Enlightenment period saw some expansion of women's roles in intellectual and social life that had implications for disability care, while women remained largely excluded from formal medical and educational institutions. Some made significant contributions to understanding and caring for individuals with developmental differences. Some Enlightenment women established or operated institutions providing care for individuals with disabilities. Their emphasis on compassionate, individualized care often differed from more institutional approaches favored by male medical professionals, creating alternative models of support that recognize the humanity and potential of individuals with special needs. The period's gradual recognition of women's intellectual capabilities and social contributions provided precedents for eventually recognizing the capabilities and contributions of individuals with various disabilities. Enlightenment arguments for expanding opportunities for women established philosophical frameworks that could be extended to other marginalized groups. The Enlightenment legacy for disability understanding. As the Age of Enlightenment drew to a close in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it had established crucial intellectual, philosophical, and methodological foundations for modern approaches to developmental differences. The period's emphasis on reason, empirical observation, natural rights, and human educability provided frameworks that would eventually support revolutionary advances in understanding and supporting individuals with Down syndrome. The Enlightenment legacy included systematic medical and educational methods, philosophical frameworks emphasizing human dignity and potential, political theories supporting universal rights and social obligations, and scientific approaches that would eventually lead to accurate understanding of genetic conditions. While individuals with Down syndrome and their families still faced enormous challenges as the Enlightenment period ended, the intellectual foundations established during this remarkable era would prove crucial for future advances. The Enlightenment's most important contribution was perhaps its fundamental optimism about human potential, and its belief that systematic inquiry and rational reform could improve the human condition. As we move forward into the 19th century, we'll see how Enlightenment foundations supported increasingly sophisticated medical understanding, systematic educational approaches, and organized reform movements that would gradually transform the lives of individuals with developmental differences. Chapter 6. The Victorian Era Scientific Discovery meets Social Reform. The dawn of modern medical understanding. The 19th century, particularly the Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, represents a pivotal moment in the history of Down syndrome, the period when medical science first began to systematically observe, document, and attempt to understand this genetic condition. This was the era when Down syndrome received its first clinical description, its first medical name, and its first attempts at systematic study. Even as broader society grappled with questions of human difference, social responsibility, and the treatment of vulnerable populations, the Victorian period was characterized by unprecedented scientific advancement, industrial transformation, social reform movements, and evolving attitudes toward disability that would profoundly shape the experiences of individuals with Down syndrome for generations to come. This was an era of both remarkable progress and troubling setbacks, of groundbreaking discoveries and persistent misconceptions, of increasing institutional care and growing social awareness. John Langdon Down and the first clinical description. The story of modern medical understanding of Down syndrome begins with British physician John Langdon Down (1828 to 1896), whose 1866 clinical description would forever link his name with his genetic condition. Working at the Earlswood Hospital for Idiots in Surrey, England, Down encountered numerous individuals with intellectual disabilities and began attempting to categorize and understand the various conditions he observed. In his landmark 1866 paper, Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots, Down described a group of individuals who shared certain physical characteristics, including distinctive facial features, shorter stature, and intellectual disabilities. Unfortunately, Down interpreted these characteristics through the deeply problematic racial theories of his time, describing these individuals as examples of Mongolian idiocy, because he believed their facial features resembled those of people from Mongolia. This racial interpretation was scientifically inaccurate and reflected the prejudiced thinking of the Victorian era. but Down's careful clinical observations represented the first systematic medical documentation of what we now understand as Down syndrome. His detailed descriptions of physical characteristics, developmental patterns, and behavioral traits provided crucial foundation for future scientific understanding. Down noted that individuals with this condition often displayed what he characterized as considerable power of imitation and could often learn various skills through patient instruction. His observations that many individuals with the condition were humorous and displayed a strong sense of the ridiculous reflected more positive aspects of his clinical documentation, suggesting that he recognized the personality and individual characteristics of the people he studied. The institutional movement and its consequences. The Victorian era witnessed the emergence of large-scale institutional care for individuals with intellectual disabilities, including those with Down syndrome. This institutional movement reflected both progressive intentions to provide systematic care and deeply problematic assumptions about the capabilities and social roles of individuals with developmental differences. Institutions like a hospital, where John Langdon Down worked, represented attempts to provide organized care, education, and training for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Victorian reformers argued that such institutions could provide specialized services, professional supervision, and structured environments that would benefit individuals with special needs while protecting them from exploitation and neglect. However, the institutional model also reflected Victorian assumptions that individuals with intellectual disabilities needed to be segregated from typical society, couldn't live independently, and required constant supervision and control. These institutions often became more focused on containment than education, more concerned with managing large populations than supporting individual development. Many Victorian institutions were established with genuinely good intentions by reformers who wanted to improve conditions for individuals with disabilities. Some provided relatively humane care, basic education, and opportunities for individuals to develop various skills and capabilities. However, the institutional model inherently limited the life experiences and opportunities available to residents. The influence of social Darwinism and eugenics. The latter part of the Victorian era saw the emergence of social Darwinism and early eugenics movements that had profoundly negative implications for individuals with Down syndrome and other developmental differences. These ideological movements, which misapplied Darwin's theories of biological evolution to human society, promoted the dangerous idea that some human beings were more evolved or fit than others. Social Darwinists argued that intellectual disabilities represented evolutionary throwbacks or genetic defects that threatened the progress of human civilization. This thinking led to arguments that individuals with conditions like Down syndrome should be prevented from reproducing, segregated from society, or even eliminated to protect the genetic health of the population. The eugenics movement, which gained strength in the late Victorian period and continued into the 20th century, promoted policies of forced sterilization, institutionalization, and social exclusion for individuals with developmental disabilities. These ideas would have devastating consequences for people with Down syndrome and their families for decades to come. While not all Victorian medical professionals embraced eugenics thinking, the intellectual climate of the era increasingly viewed developmental differences through the lens of genetic deficiency and social burden rather than human diversity, deserving support and inclusion. Educational innovations and the development of special education. Despite the challenges posed by institutional models and eugenic thinking, the Victorian era also saw significant innovations in educational approaches for individuals with developmental differences. Some Victorian educators and medical professionals recognized that individuals with conditions like Down syndrome could benefit from appropriate instruction and could develop various capabilities when provided with patient-individualized teaching. Dr. Edouard Seguin, 1812–1880, a French physician who worked extensively with individuals with intellectual disabilities, developed innovative educational methods that emphasized sensory training, motor skill development, and systematic instruction, adapted to each individual's capabilities. Seguin's work demonstrated that individuals with developmental differences could learn various skills and could benefit significantly from appropriate educational intervention. Maria Montessori, 1870–1952, though her major work came slightly later, was influenced by Victorian educational innovations and developed teaching methods that recognized different learning styles and developmental patterns. Her emphasis on individualized instruction and respect for each child's unique characteristics would eventually benefit individuals with various disabilities. Some Victorian institutions attempted to provide systematic educational programs for their residents, including individuals with Down syndrome. While these programs were often limited by the understanding and resources of the time, they represented important recognition that individuals with developmental differences could learn and develop various capabilities. Family responses and private care. Not all individuals with Down syndrome during the Victorian era were placed in institutions. Many families, particularly those with adequate financial resources, chose to care for their family members at home, often with the assistance of private tutors, governesses, or specialized caregivers. Victorian families that chose home care often developed creative approaches to supporting their family members with Down syndrome. Some employed private teachers who worked individually with their children. Others arranged for music, art, or craft instruction that recognized their family members' interests and capabilities. The Victorian era's emphasis on family duty and moral obligation meant that many families felt strong responsibilities to provide care for all family members, regardless of their abilities. While this could sometimes lead to overprotection or limitation of opportunities, it also meant that many individuals with Down syndrome grew up surrounded by family love and support. Some Victorian families became advocates for better understanding and treatment of developmental differences, using their social influence and resources to promote more enlightened approaches. These early family advocates helped lay groundwork for future parent advocacy movements. Medical and scientific advances. While the Victorian era predated accurate genetic understanding, it saw significant advances in medical knowledge that laid foundations for eventually understanding the true causes of Down syndrome. Victorian physicians developed more systematic approaches to studying human development, documenting case histories, and attempting to identify patterns in various conditions. The period's emphasis on detailed clinical observation led to increasingly sophisticated descriptions of Down syndrome and other developmental conditions. Victorian medical journals began publishing case studies and clinical observations that would prove valuable for future researchers. Some Victorian physicians began to recognize that Down syndrome occurred across all social classes and ethnic groups, challenging earlier assumptions about its causes and significance. These observations helped undermine some of the more prejudiced interpretations of the condition. The development of photography during the Victorian era allowed for the first systematic visual documentation of individuals with Down syndrome, providing important records for future medical research and understanding. Social reform movements and changing attitudes. The Victorian era was characterized by numerous social reform movements that gradually influenced attitudes toward disability and social responsibility. While these reforms often remained paternalistic and limited, they represented important steps toward recognizing society's obligations to support vulnerable populations. Victorian reformers increasingly argued that society had responsibilities to provide care, education, and support for individuals with disabilities, rather than simply relying on private charity or family resources. This thinking led to the establishment of numerous institutions, schools, and support services. Though these often remained segregated and limited, some Victorian reformers began to challenge the more extreme forms of social exclusion and discrimination faced by individuals with disabilities. While full inclusion remained distant, these early reform movements established precedents for more systematic advocacy efforts. The Victorian era's emphasis on moral improvement and social progress created intellectual climates that sometimes supported more compassionate approaches to disability, even as scientific misconceptions and social prejudices created significant barriers. International developments and cross-cultural exchange. The Victorian era's increased international communication and exchange meant that different national approaches to disability could be compared and evaluated. Victorian physicians, educators, and reformers traveled between different countries, sharing observations and methods. German and French approaches to educating individuals with developmental differences influenced British and American practices during this period. The international exchange of ideas helped accelerate the development of more effective educational and care methods. However, international exchange also unfortunately helped spread some of the more problematic ideas of the era, including eugenic thinking and segregationist approaches that would have negative consequences for individuals with disabilities. Literature and cultural representations. Victorian literature occasionally included sympathetic portrayals of individuals with developmental differences, though these representations were often sentimentalized or stereotypical. Some Victorian authors wrote about characters with disabilities in ways that emphasized their humanity and value, while others reinforced negative stereotypes. Charles Dickens, for example, included characters with various disabilities in his novels, sometimes portraying them as objects of pity, but also sometimes recognizing their dignity and worth. These literary representations both reflected and influenced Victorian attitudes toward disability. The Victorian era's emphasis on moral instruction and social improvement meant that some literature began to explore themes of social responsibility toward vulnerable populations, including individuals with developmental differences. The complex Victorian legacy. As the Victorian era drew to a close, it left a complex and contradictory legacy regarding Down syndrome and developmental differences. On one hand, the period had established the first systematic medical understanding of the condition, developed early educational approaches, and created institutional systems intended to provide care and support. On the other hand, the Victorian era had also established patterns of segregation, medical pathologizing, and eugenic thinking that would create enormous challenges for individuals with Down syndrome and their families well into the 20th century. The Victorian period's most significant contribution was perhaps its establishment of systematic approaches to studying, documenting, and attempting to understand developmental differences. While the understanding remained limited and often misguided, the methodological foundations established during this era would prove crucial for future advances. The institutional model developed during the Victorian era would dominate approaches to disability care for nearly a century, with both positive and negative consequences. While institutions sometimes provided care and protection, they also limited opportunities, enforced segregation, and often emphasized containment over development. As we move forward into the 20th century, we'll see how Victorian foundations, both positive and negative, influenced the dramatic changes that would eventually transform the lives of individuals with Down syndrome and their families. Chapter 7. The Early 20th Century Tragedy and Transformation. The dark shadow of eugenics. The early decades of the 20th century represent perhaps the most challenging and tragic period in the history of individuals with Down syndrome. This era, roughly spanning from 1900 to 1950, was dominated by the rise of systematic eugenics movements that viewed developmental differences as genetic threats to be eliminated rather than human variations, deserving support and inclusion. The eugenics movement, which gained momentum in the United States, Europe, and other regions during this period, promoted the deeply flawed and morally reprehensible idea that society could be improved by preventing the reproduction of individuals deemed genetically unfit. People with Down syndrome, along with others with developmental differences, became primary targets of eugenic policies that included forced sterilization, institutionalization, and in Nazi Germany, systematic murder. This period reminds us that scientific advancement doesn't automatically lead to moral progress, and that societies can embrace policies of enormous cruelty even while making remarkable technological and medical advances. The early 20th century's treatment of individuals with Down syndrome serves as a sobering reminder of humanity's capacity for both tremendous compassion and terrible cruelty. The American eugenics movement in the United States. The eugenics movement gained significant momentum in the early 1900s, promoted by prominent scientists, politicians, and social reformers who believed they could improve society by controlling human reproduction. The movement established research institutions, lobbied for legislation, and created propaganda campaigns that portrayed individuals with developmental differences as burdens on society and threats to genetic health. The American Eugenics Society, founded in 1926, promoted policies of forced sterilization for individuals with intellectual disabilities, including those with Down syndrome. By 1931, states had passed laws allowing or requiring sterilization of individuals deemed genetically defective, and an estimated 65,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under these laws. These sterilization programs specifically targeted individuals with Down syndrome and other developmental differences, operating under the false assumption that these conditions were always inherited and that preventing reproduction would eliminate them from the population. The scientific understanding underlying these policies was fundamentally flawed, but the human consequences were devastating. Many individuals with Down syndrome were sterilized without their knowledge or consent, often while residing in state institutions. Families were told that sterilization was medically necessary or beneficial, and many had little power to resist institutional policies. These programs represented systematic violations of human rights and bodily autonomy that continued, in some states, into the 1970s. The tragedy of Nazi Germany. The Nazi regime in Germany, 1933 to 1945, implemented the most extreme and deadly eugenic policies in human history, policies that had catastrophic consequences for individuals with Down syndrome and other developmental differences. The Nazi ideology viewed people with disabilities as life unworthy of life and systematically murdered an estimated 275,000 individuals with disabilities during World War II. The Nazi euthanasia program, euphemistically called Action T4, began with the systematic killing of children with disabilities in specialized facilities. Children with Down syndrome were among the first victims of these programs, which used medical rhetoric to justify mass murder. Nazi propaganda portrayed the killing of disabled individuals as merciful relief from suffering and beneficial elimination of genetic defects. The program later expanded to include adults with disabilities, operating through a network of killing centers that used poison gas and other methods to murder individuals transferred from institutions throughout Nazi-controlled territory. Many people with Down syndrome died in these facilities, victims of an ideology that denied their fundamental humanity and right to exist. The Nazi program also influenced eugenic thinking in other countries, including the United States, where some advocates praised German policies as models for American programs. This international influence demonstrates how eugenic ideas could spread across borders and gain acceptance even in democratic societies. Institutional life and its limitations for those individuals with Down syndrome who survived the eugenic policies of the early 20th century. Life was often confined to large state institutions that prioritized containment and control over education and development. These institutions, many of which housed thousands of residents, became the primary form of care for individuals with developmental differences throughout much of the 20th century. Life in these institutions was frequently characterized by overcrowding, inadequate staffing, limited educational opportunities, and strict regimentation that left little room for individual expression or development. Many institutions operated more like warehouses for storing unwanted individuals than like therapeutic environments designed to support human growth and potential. Residents of these institutions, including individuals with Down syndrome, often faced abuse, neglect, and dehumanizing treatment. Staff members, overwhelmed by impossible caseloads and limited resources, sometimes resorted to harsh disciplinary methods and institutional routines that prioritized efficiency over individual needs and dignity. Despite these systemic problems, some institutions and some individual staff members provided more humane care and recognized the humanity and potential of their residents. A few progressive institutions attempted to provide educational programs, recreational activities, and individualized attention that helped residents develop their capabilities and maintain their dignity. Family responses and professional advice. During the early 20th century, families who had children with Down syndrome faced enormous pressure from medical professionals and social authorities to institutionalize their loved ones. The prevailing professional wisdom was that children with Down syndrome would be burdens on their families and society, and that institutional care was the most appropriate and humane option. Many physicians advised parents to place their newborns with Down syndrome in institutions immediately, often suggesting that parents tell other family members and friends that the baby had died. This advice was based on assumptions that children with Down syndrome couldn't learn, couldn't contribute to family life, and would only cause suffering for themselves and their families.